All right, it's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Nikole Hollins-Sims. Nikole is an educational consultant for the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network in the Harrisburg office. She currently serves as the co-statewide lead for the Behavior Initiative, as well as being an active member of the Multi-Tiered Systems of Support Initiative. In addition, Dr. Hollins-Sims is a special advisor for equity for the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And she has also conducted research around caregivers of children of incarcerated parents and their motivation to engage in family school partnerships. So I'm now going to turn it over to Nikole.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity to showcase the work that we've been doing across the Commonwealth related to equity. I am assuming that pretty soon my PowerPoint will appear. Yep, here it comes. So with that, I have 20 minutes, so I'm going to set a timer because I can get very passionate about this topic and talk for a while. So I want to be cognizant and respectful of the time. So I'm going to begin now and just wait for the presentation mode to showcase. Okay, so what I like to do whenever we start is to talk about 4 agreements of a courageous conversation, and that is something that can ground our efforts as we think about talking about the topic of equity, which can always be somewhat uncomfortable for some. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but I think these 4 agreements would be helpful for anyone who is engaging in conversations related to bias, related to equitable practices, related to culturally responsive practices, etc. So number 1 is to stay engaged. There may be things that are said or discussed that might be difficult to remain connected, but just asking folks to stay engaged, to listen, to speak your truth, being willing to be authentic in any questions that you have and any dialogue that you wish to engage in, and being clear that it is your truth that you are speaking and not the truth of someone else. Knowing that we will experience discomfort. The only way to make change as we talk about equity or implementing equitable practices is to sometimes be uncomfortable. There are a lot of pieces of research and data that speak to things that may not sound great to us or make us wonder why they're happening for certain groups. And that can be uncomfortable when we do some introspection. And lastly, expect and accept non-closure. Anytime we talk about equity, this work, the work of anti-racism, the work of being addressing transphobia, or things that are related to being homophobic, etc., they're not things that we can fix in 20 minutes, in a day-long training, in a week-long training. It's ongoing as we grow and evolve. Next slide. And so Governor Tom Wolf, who is the leader of our great Commonwealth, indicated post-2016 that we needed to be thinking from a school and community lens about the principles that our Commonwealth was founded on, which are tolerance, religious freedom, and justice, and that these are values that Pennsylvanians continue to embrace today. The administration's committed to creating a culture of inclusiveness where students are made to feel welcome and valued, and that it's important that we celebrate diversity and teach the importance of respect for self and others. And so with that charge, the role that I have with the Department of Education and also as a consultant at PaTTAN is to operationalize what that means. Why do we need to talk about equity? Why do we need to create spaces for young people to feel not only physically safe, but also psychologically and emotionally? Next slide. And so our former Secretary of Education talked about taking that a step further. And so he made this comment, our former Secretary Pedro Rivera, in September of 2020, shortly after what has been called the Racial Reckoning Summer. And as we think about what he says here, I'm not going to read it verbatim, but he talks about how the things that have been in place in our educational systems are structures that need to be dismantled. And they've been ongoing for a very long time. And as leaders in education, it's important to take the outrage or the angst that we have about these wrongs and correct them through that dismantling process and ensure that we're the change agents and serve as community leaders. Next slide. And so just very briefly, I want to highlight the Pennsylvania Equity and Inclusion Toolkit. And this can be found if you simply go to the PDE website, Pennsylvania Department of Education. You can Google it. You can access this Equity and Inclusion Toolkit that was developed shortly after the 2016 presidential election, where there were incidents across the Commonwealth where students obviously were at polar opposites of their affiliations. And so with that, we wanted to provide administrators and school systems with a guide or a toolkit on prevention, response, and recovery. Next slide. And thank you, Maria, for putting that in the chat. And so this is the way that the toolkit is organized. Again, prevention, what can we do in a preventative way so that we can ensure that the systems that are in place are responsive to the needs of all? If there is an incident, so just for full transparency, the incident that I'm referring to that I had to support post 2016 and involved students holding signs of the former president, shouting "Go back to Mexico," shouting "White Power," and then the students that received that messaging wanted to stage a sit-in in response to that. Administration had difficulty knowing how to navigate all of that. So the toolkit talks about how do you respond in those incidents. And then once it happens, how do you as a system recover? Next slide. And so I think in any of this work, it's important to ground us in the definition of equity. And so Pennsylvania has adopted the following. Every student has access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, sexual orientation, family background, and/or family income, not to exclude religion and gender identity. Next slide. And so as we again think about the definition that Pennsylvania has adopted and what that may look like in practice, you may or may not have seen a depiction of what equity versus equality means. And so the picture that you see in front of you, for me, is the most connected to a school perspective. And so if we take a look at equality on the left-hand side, you can see all varying types of students trying to access the content, which is on the blackboard. But each of them, when given an equal box to stand on, are not necessarily able to access the content as everyone else. So when we talk about this difference, sometimes we hear, well, everything should be equal. When we really unpack what that means, equality does not necessarily equate to what we hope students have access to. And so over on the right-hand side is the definition of equity, which allows for that right moment in the student's education to get what they need so that they have access at a similar level to their other peers. So as you can see in the picture, we have all different types of students. Some need 2 boxes, some need 1, some don't need any, and others need other types of access opportunities, for instance, assistive technology. Next slide. And so what does the field say when we talk about equity? And you can see these pretty much how we think about equity and sometimes conflate some of those understandings of what it means. So when I'm out in the field and doing trainings, I hear things such as, we're a rural district, we don't have racial diversity, so I don't think equity applies to us. Or this is overplayed. It's a new buzzword that we always just tend to say, but don't really know what we're doing. We also get the silo approach. We aren't doing equity. We're focused on trauma and mental health, not realizing that when we're equitable, we're addressing the things such as trauma, mental health, and all of those other things that students present with. And the last one, unfortunately, I hear more often than not, here's one more thing. Where can I get training to check this off? And unfortunately, that is not systemically how we can bring about systems change to dismantle those barriers we talked about earlier. Next slide. And so what are the educational inequities? We talk about what is equity, but how do we even get there? How do we know whether or not something's inequitable? And so for this slide, I thought it was important to not only indicate the spotlight of where we are currently, which is a place of civil unrest. We're dealing with a pandemic, which some have called the dual pandemic, the physical pandemic, and the other pandemic being that of racism and other isms that impact students in different ways and adults as well, communities at large. But as we unpack what inequities look like, it's not just one thing that creates inequities, particularly in education. As you can see, the list is pretty expansive. So we have societal inequities, things that lend themselves to bias, whether that's implicit or explicit. We have socioeconomic inequity. So we just heard from Mandy and team talk about SES or socioeconomic status and how that can impact results for students and communities. Cultural inequities, so the background that people come to us with, and culture can expand beyond ethnicity and race. It can speak to the culture of being a student who identifies as gay or a student who's homeless. Those are all cultures. Familial inequities. Some families have access to certain things, other families do not. Programmatic, staffing, instructional, assessment, and linguistic equities all speak to within the educational space how certain students, again, have access to certain things, whether it's highly qualified teachers, AP or advanced placement courses, instruction that is comprehensive and culturally responsive to their needs, assessment, how are we evaluating students and does that have a bias and it doesn't account for some of the cultural differences, and then linguistic, thinking about the different languages that students and families speak and are we responding to them adequately. Next slide. And so just very briefly, I wanted to showcase some data around COVID-19 in particular, and from a statewide lens, the data that we have. And the first set of bullets is actually a Michigan state study, so that's more on a national scale. But what we found is that there's an impact when there's limited to no access to home computers and internet. And what is found is that students who don't have access to that tend to trail behind their peers in digital skills, have lower GPAs, and are less likely to plan to attend college. Now, we know that those inequities may have been exacerbated as a result of COVID-19, but on a national level, we know there are deserts around the country where there's lack of access to these things. As we think about from a Pennsylvania lens, those that had limited to no access to home and computers or internet, Latino and American Indian was about 28%, followed by Black at 26%. And then those students that were without a home computer, Latino at 21%, American Indian at 18%, and Black at 14%. And so again, as we take those criteria and then think about rural spaces versus metro, we're finding in Pennsylvania our rural spaces are the ones that are demonstrating high inequities related to access to these types of needed technologies. Next slide. So how do we address it? I've given you the problem, so what do we do? So from an educational perspective, what we have articulated are what are called the equity pillars of practice. And so they're listed out there for you. And one of the things that I wanted to put into the chat, if you give me a minute, is the PDE Equitable Practices Hub. And in that hub, what you will find is that those pillars are delineated, and in each of the pillars, a user can go to that particular place and access resources based on a school and district lens, a classroom lens, or an individual lens. And so each one of these pillars is critical to addressing what we just highlighted as inequities in education. So general system practices such as hiring, so students see other people that look like them as teachers. This also speaks to adopting frameworks so that there's a safety component. So things like positive behavior interventions and supports, or PBIS, or MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. These are frameworks that allow students to be met at their right moment of need to address those needs in a tiered structure. Self-awareness really speaks to unpacking who are you, bias, privilege, power, etc. Data practices, addressing disproportionality. Family and community engagement cannot be understated. Equity work is driven by the input of families and communities to know if we're making the difference that needs to be made. Then the next two sort of go hand in hand, academic equity and disciplinary equity. Academic equity speaks to access to content. It speaks to classroom structures. It speaks to access to AP, advanced placement, or access to special education, etc. Disciplinary equity, on the other hand, while connected to academics, highlights behavior. So suspensions, expulsions, restraints, etc. So all of those things are really critical to understanding how to address inequities. Next slide. Okay, and so what has happened was the development of the Equitable Practices Hub, which we have included in the chat. And so when you take a look at this, again, please take your time and go through it. We've had a lot of great feedback about what is available. These have been vetted resources that really speak to each one of the pillars and how it could potentially inform your practice. Next slide. So why do we need to detect disproportionality? Why is that important? Next slide. The data from Pennsylvania is as follows. And so this comes from the ProPublica database. So about 33% of our student population is non-white. About 47% of our student population access free and reduced lunch. So that speaks to socioeconomic status. Our high school graduation rate is approximately 86%. But then when we start, pardon me, unpacking gaps, what we see are opportunity gaps and disciplinary gaps. I'm one who's very high on terminology. And so what I would challenge us to do is to move away from saying achievement gap and saying opportunity gaps. Because what we're finding is that in a lot of these circumstances, it's a lack of opportunity, not necessarily an internal issue with the child. And so as we think about that, when we look at this data, white students are this many times more likely to be in an advanced placement class compared with Black students. So when we look at that, that number is 2.3. So when we read it, white students are 2 times more likely to be in an AP class compared with Black students. With discipline, Black students are 5, almost 6 times more likely to be suspended compared with white peers. Disproportionality. Why we have to address it is because I'm a mom of a 3-year-old Black boy. And so when he turns 5 and goes to kindergarten, what that data says is that the likelihood of him receiving a suspension when he walks in the door simply because he's a Black boy is 5 times higher than perhaps his best friend who happens to be white. That's a problem. And so we have to begin to address it. Next slide. And so in addressing it, what does that look like? How do we begin the process? And one of the pillars is self-awareness. And so for time's sake, I'm not going to go through this entire continuum. What I want you to take away, though, from this continuum is that we all operate on a continuum. So there's no binary of good and bad people. Essentially, we move up and down this continuum all of the time as it relates to cultural proficiency and how we begin to understand our biases, our privileges, our powers, and how we can leverage them to make the changes we want to see, not only for my son, but for students that we have across the Commonwealth. So just to give a highlight, at cultural destructiveness, this is saying things like if we didn't have special ed students, our scores would be higher. Some people operate from that lens, not intending to necessarily be that dramatic, however, not realizing that that's discounting, degrading an entire group of people. At the very top of the continuum, then we have proficiency, which is the utopia, the panacea that we're all seeking to go to. But each of us, again, move up and down this continuum all of the time. And in the middle is blindness. So when we have people who say, I don't see color, that's a form of blindness. Or we have people who say, our system's fine. We don't have an issue here about gender. It's a form of blindness. And so we want to be cognizant that we can't live in those spaces because intent versus impact is so critical. Next slide, and I'm going to try to breeze through. So what does this sound like in schools? I gave you an example of that. Why try to help them? They'll end up in jail just like their dad. Parents don't come to parent conferences because they don't care about the education of their children, etc. Next slide. And so as we think about those comments and that movement on the continuum, that really speaks often to implicit bias, which is a mental process that stimulates negative attitudes about people who are not members of one's own in-group. Implicit means sometimes we're not even aware we're feeling or thinking about it, whereas explicit would be very outward, being very clear, I'm trying to be derogatory. So when people make bias statements, that intent versus impact, the next slide really speaks to what you can do. Teaching Tolerance, which has now changed its name, and I'm excited for this, Learning for Justice. If you were to visit learningforjustice.org, there's a 4-step process to speak up against bias. Number one is to interrupt. So to interrupt that comment. Number two is to question. What did you mean by that? Help me understand where you were going. Number three is to educate. I know those parents, and that's not been my experience with them. And number four is to echo. Hopefully, you have someone else next to you that we may call an ally or a co conspirator that can echo what you just educated that person around. So, those four steps are not only good for adults, but also for students. And that should be the close of my time. And so if you have any questions for me, please do not hesitate. My email is listed there as well as my phone number. And I, again, thank you for your time.